Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged for a return to diplomacy and, quote, maximum efforts to prevent an all-out regional war after Israel bombed Iranian military facilities and air defense systems Saturday. The strikes included a site linked to Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran said 4 soldiers were killed. Israel also struck air defense batteries and radars in Syria and Iraq. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said Iran would take an appropriate response to the attack, but he reiterated Iran does not seek a wider war. Israel's attack came about 4 weeks after Iran launched a missile attack on Israeli military sites in response to Israel's mounting assault on Lebanon and Israel's assassination of Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. The Hamas leader they killed in Tehran on the inauguration day of the Iranian president. As the death toll from Israel's 24-day siege on northern Gaza tops 1,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, the UN's top humanitarian official is warning, quote, the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying, unquote. At Kamal Adwan Hospital, Israeli soldiers arrested and expelled nearly all male doctors and staff following its brutal raid. One of the victims of the raid was the hospital's director, Dr. Hassam Abu Safia's young son, Ibrahim. On Saturday, Dr. Abu Safia led prayers for his murdered child as he laid him to rest. A nurse who survived the Israeli attack on Kamal Adwan described the siege.
We were all surrounded from all sides. There was shooting from all directions with bombs and mortars, and they evacuated all those who were sheltering here so that everyone leaves, both men and women. They separated men from women and made 2 queues. It was very, very humiliating for our men since they took them without clothes and nothing to cover with.
Elsewhere in Gaza, an employee of Doctors Without Borders was killed in Khan Yunis, and at least 3 more journalists were killed in an Israeli airstrike. They were identified as Sayed Radwan of Al-Aqsa TV, Hamza Abu Salmiya from Sanad News, and Hanin Mahmoud Baroud from the Al-Quds Foundation. Meanwhile, lawyers at the U.S. Justice Department called on Attorney General Merrick Garland to launch investigations into crimes against U.S. citizens committed by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the occupied West Bank, including the killing of the activist Aishinur Aigi. The letter to Garland highlighted the hypocrisy in the department's refusal to acknowledge crimes by Israel while it's been outspoken against Russia's actions in Ukraine. Israeli strikes in the southern Lebanese city of Tyre have killed at least 7 people today. The Israeli military issued evacuation orders for large areas of Tyre as it continues its deadly attacks. Meanwhile, Lebanon's health minister says Israeli strikes have targeted 55 hospitals in Lebanon as Israel seeks to impair the country's health infrastructure. Here in the United States, Microsoft has fired 2 workers who organized a vigil for Gaza. The employees, who are both Arab, belong to the protest group No Azure for Apartheid, which opposes Microsoft's sale of its cloud technology to Israel. Meanwhile, Harvard University has temporarily suspended dozens of students and professors from its libraries after they staged a series of silent study-in protests to bring attention to genocide in Gaza, as well as the crackdown on free speech at Harvard. Here in New York, Donald Trump headlined a major campaign rally at Madison Square Garden Sunday, holding what the New York Times described as a closing carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism, unquote. During his speech, Trump described Democrats as the, quote, enemy from within, and repeatedly attacked immigrants, claiming the United States is now a, quote, occupied country. Other speakers included Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tucker Carlson, Stephen Miller, and Hulk Hogan. The rally began with the conservative comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, who called Puerto Rico an island of garbage.
A lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico's resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, called the remarks despicable, inappropriate, and disgusting. During his time on the stage, Tony Hinchcliffe also mocked a black man whom he said carved watermelons for Halloween. Another speaker called Kamala Harris the Antichrist, waving a cross. Democratic vice presidential candidate Governor Tim Walz compared Trump's rally to the pro-Nazi rally held at Madison Square Garden in 1939. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris held major rallies over the weekend, including in Houston, where she campaigned with Beyoncé Friday night. Harris addressed abortion rights in her speech.
He brags about overturning Roe v. Wade. In his own words, quote, "I did it and I'm proud to have done it." That's what he says. And one has to ask, proud that women are dying? Proud that doctors and nurses could be thrown in prison for life for administering life-saving care?
At a rally in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Michelle Obama took to the stage to warn against another Trump presidency.
I hope that you'll forgive me if I'm a little angry that we are indifferent to his erratic behavior, his obvious mental decline, his history as a convicted felon, a known slumlord, a predator found liable for sexual abuse.
In media news, the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post are both facing turmoil after the paper's publishers announced no presidential endorsements would be made this year. The LA Times is owned by billionaire Patrick Soon-Shiong, and the Washington Post is owned by Amazon's Jeff Bezos. Two veteran journalists at the LA Times, Robert Greene and Karen Klein, resigned in protest, as did the editorial's editor, Mariel Garza, who wrote, quote, "How could we spend 8 years railing against Trump and the danger his leadership poses to the country and then failed to endorse the perfectly decent Democrat challenger who we previously endorsed for the U.S. Senate," unquote. In other election news, a judge in Virginia has blocked an attempt by the state's Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin to purge close to 2,000 Virginians from the voter rolls. The judge ruled the purge violated the National Voter Registration Act. The UN is warning of atrocious crimes in Sudan's central Zira state after reports of mass killings by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. At least 124 civilians were killed by the RSF over the past week, according to on-the-ground reports. The year-and-a-half-long war in Sudan has killed tens of thousands of people, displaced more than 11 million, and triggered a devastating humanitarian and health crisis. This is a displaced mother in South Kordofan state whose son died of hunger.
I held him up and I found his body stiffened. I carried him and I ran to my neighbor and I asked her to have a look at him. She told me, "Your son is gone." He used to tell me, "When the road to Khartoum opens, we will go back."
In Uruguay, voters will cast ballots in a presidential runoff next month after no candidate obtained sufficient support to claim victory in Sunday's election. Yamandu Orsi, a center-left former mayor and history teacher, won the most votes but did not reach the 50% threshold to outright defeat Álvaro Delgado of the ruling center-right Partido Nacional. Orsi is an ally of the former president, José Pepe Mujica, an ex-guerrilla-turned politician who's credited with turning Uruguay into South America's most socially liberal country. Former Bolivian President Evo Morales blamed sitting President Luis Arce after Morales' vehicle came under fire in what Morales said was an attempted assassination Sunday. This comes amidst mounting tensions between Arce and Morales. Both men belong to the ruling MAS party, have announced plans to represent the party in Bolivia's 2025 presidential election. Arce has accused Morales of destabilizing Bolivia by calling for road blockades and protests. Morales has said he's being persecuted by Arce's government, including what he claims are false accusations of statutory rape. And in Arizona, President Biden issued a formal apology for government-run Native American boarding schools, which separated indigenous families and sought to exterminate Native cultures. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, the first-ever Native American cabinet secretary, addressed the event at the Gila Country Community School.
Tens of thousands of Indigenous children as young as 4 years old were taken from their families and communities and forced into boarding schools run by the U.S. government and religious institutions. These federal Indian boarding schools have impacted every Indigenous person I know. Some are survivors, some are descendants, but we all carry the trauma that these policies and these places inflicted.
Biden's speech was briefly interrupted by an Indigenous protester who shouted, "How can you apologize for a genocide while committing a genocide in Palestine?" We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast with Nick Tilson, founder of the Indigenous organizing group NDN Collective. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.